Hello and welcome to the Voice of Reason podcast. This is Benjamin Boyce, your host, and today's guest is Shaun Cammack. Shaun Cammack is a recent graduate from the University of Chicago, where he attained a master's degree in sociology, and his thesis was The Evergreen Affair, a Social Justice Society. So what Shaun has done is taken the video footage that I have amassed over the 3 years that I've been studying the 2017 Evergreen State College protests, and he submits all that data to some quite fascinating sociological voodoo and comes up with the story or the description of a moral community that is operating at that point in history. What happened at Evergreen in 2017 has been widely replicated in 2020, and Shaun's research actually provides us some amount of understanding into what is actually operating in these different anti-racist or anti-discrimination movements. So without further ado, here is Shaun Cammack.
You're the first expert.
I'm the first expert, yeah.
Aren't you?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I guess so.
Why did you choose Evergreen?
I mean, it was... There's two reasons. Like everyone else watching it, I was just like confused and like enthralled by what was going on. Like, what the hell? What is this? Right? I don't get it. So there was that was always just kind of like niggling away through like the years before I went back to school. And then when I was at school, I was like searching for a project, and that popped back up. I was like, maybe I could do something investigating this. And then when I reached out to you and you sent me your archive, it's like, well, this is the best data set. Like, I've got to do it now. This is I brought it to my advisor, and he was like, yeah, you have to do it now. He gave you the data. You have to do it. I was like, hell yeah, for sure. That was it. It's just fascinating. It's just really fascinating. I think a lot of people, unfortunately, who deal with it are they're either very dismissive of it or purely critical of it, instead of trying to understand it before they criticize. Now, criticism is super important, particularly with the way that they see the world. Like, it needs criticism to sort of keep it from derailing and taking over other things. But I thought that a lot of the discourse around Evergreen was like, oh, they're crazy, immature students running amok, and we should just mock them. And while some of it's very mockable and open for mocking, we should really understand it first before at least for me, I wanted to understand it before I went and said, okay, no, this is something that maybe we should be very cautious about buying into and going into.
Okay.
Yeah.
What counts as understanding? What are the parameters of understanding?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, there's two ways. Like, they have a way they see the world, right? And you can understand it kind of the way, like, maybe like James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose do, which is like really full, like in the content of what they believe, like the fully explicated content. This is, they think the world is this, or America is like a white supremacist power structure. I think the way that I wanted to understand it was more along like the structure of how they believe, describing the form of what they believe, without any sort of moral valence to it or any sort of like criticism or value proposition in there. So I can just stand back and say, okay, this is how their belief system sort of works. This is a way to describe it that isn't affirming it or criticizing it like just out the gate. But yeah, and I don't think I totally get it, but I think I've moved towards getting it. I think there's a whole lot more that people could do. Mm-hmm. I mean, even with your archive, like people could go through that again and again and again, and we'd learn something new, something more. There's some stuff in the research that I didn't include in the thesis that I really would love that people could go into a lot more. Yeah.
What are the parameters of what you studied then about Evergreen? Like a date range or... Sure. So my sort of... I put it
the furthest data I go back to is 2017. There was a focus group done in 2017, which you might be, you're probably familiar with. It was just Evergreen did a focus group where they interviewed a bunch of students of color about their experiences, and then they put out this summary of it, and that was like my starting point. I coded that, and then all the way up to that like climactic couple of days in the end of the spring semester, not quarter.
Quarter, it's quarter.
Oh, is it quarter?
Yeah,
oh, it's like UC. Okay, cool. Okay, like quarter. That was sort of my date range, but I really focused in on those couple of days, mostly back to like November with the canoe meeting, which was it was November 16th, right? Because that's where most of the data, that's where all the video was, right? So that's mostly what I focused on. And there's a good criticism that I got from someone about that, because it's like, well, could this possibly be amplified, right? Could the way they see the world be amplified because you're only really looking at this in a very animated, polarized sort of time? That's a really good criticism. Mm-hmm. And certainly possible it is, but at the very least I get to see it when it is fully explicate, when it is fully like going at 100, I think we can see the structures of it more clearly. So I think that actually worked in my favor.
Okay.
But I'm like the discipline that I study in is cultural psychology, and the maxim of cultural psychology is that culture and psyche make each other up. So there's this really like you really focus on the ideas underpinning people's individual attitudes, and then individual attitudes can go into social action and organization. So really looking at their sort of moral foundations. Like John Haidt looks at moral foundations, right? Looking into those ideas, how they see the world, how they perceive themselves, and how that sort of underpins action. That's one way to do cultural psychology. It's a rational reconstruction of the beliefs and practices of the other. That's one kind of cultural psychology. So that's basically what I was trying to do with Evergreen.
And just shortly, what was your... you said coding. You coded things. What's that about?
Yeah, so my methodology was qualitative coding, which is a very... I really enjoy qualitative coding. It is... You take a look... Hey, Katie. How are you? You look at... Sorry.
No. She's there to be pet.
Okay, good. So coding is when you take a datum, a piece of information, and you apply some sort of label to it, a code. Right, like color coding, you know what I'm talking about. You do a piece of data and you apply a label to it, and there's different techniques for doing that, right? So if I say something about my family, you can code that statement I made as family. Subject references family.
Okay.
Right, like that. And then you go through all this information and you collect all these sorts of codes. You see, oh, lots of people are talking about family in reference to this, and you start seeing patterns that emerge out of these codes that you've attributed to all this data. And then you categorize all of those codes, and then you can sort of build theory and broader sort of conceptual arguments based on that information. So more technically what that looks like is I watched every minute of your archive, and when there was something that fell in the parameters of what I was looking for, which was attitudes, values, beliefs, whenever they say something like that, or when they do certain things, ways that they sort of socially, physically shape themselves or order themselves, I would code that. I would say, oh, this is an attitude, subject is against police, right? Doesn't want, wants to defund the police. So I would code that attitude wants to defund the police. And then I ended up with 1,700 of those.
Wait, different tags or events that you tagged?
Pieces of information.
Okay.
So 1,700 coded segments.
Okay.
And then I start, categorize as I go along, and then build my broader sort of argument out of that. It's qualitative, so I mean it's a subjective process. I'm trying to wrap my head around this, and there's a lot of subjective processes that go into that, but it's a pretty systematic way of going through big data sets of like qualitative information.
As far as data sets go, how big is 1,700 data points? And
it's pretty sizable. Yeah, it is pretty sizable. It's unique. What was unique about this is that it was mostly video, because a lot of times you're coding interview transcripts. You interview someone, you transcribe their, your conversation, and then you code those. But video, the fact that they filmed and streamed everything they did, like that's very unique and new. Because people didn't do that 10 years ago. People didn't do that. Yeah. Maybe even 5 years ago, people didn't really do that. So that's a really new kind of data that comes out. Yeah. So that was like interesting to code it that way. I enjoyed it though.
The thing about Evergreen, just as a story, well, what I conceive of as a story, but you'd probably conceive of it as some other fancy science word, is that it's complex enough to be very rich in detail, but it's not so complex that it's impossible to make sense of. Like something that's going on in Portland, 70 days of riots, you could probably see a lot of the same patterns going on there as you see at Evergreen, but it would be so much more work to actually go through and to really wrap your head around that. Do you feel that what do you feel about that? Like how complex versus how simple the Evergreen story is?
You're right. Like, because most of what was filmed at Evergreen happened over a couple of days, like within a week or so, it's just this little like slice of the slice of social life. So there's a fairly, clear beginning and end to that like climax of what was going on. Yeah. But I don't think Evergreen is that simple. I think there's a lot more. I think there's a lot more to be understood about it. Like there's a political story to be understood about it.
What do you mean by political?
Like how do actors who have this sort of worldview capture institutional positions and build coalitions within the school?
She's just gonna come back.
What a cutie. Like how do actors gain positions in the institution and build coalitions?
Okay.
Power. Where did the Equity Council, the Equity and Inclusion Council, where did that come from? How did that conversation get started in the institution? And then, because I know George like chartered it, but how did we get there? There's definitely more to learn about it, for sure.
So what then did you study? What aspect of it do you think that you studied? The behavior of the students or the behavior of like kind of that crowd at that time?
What I was trying to understand was the fundamental beliefs and moral orientations that underpinned that action and those attitudes. Like the way that they see the world, and how did that underpin what they did?
Okay.
Very much so interested in their worldview. Yeah.
So, what is this worldview? Do you have like a label?
Yeah. Well, it's hard. I think it can be characterized in a couple of basic. I think there's a couple of parts of it the way that I characterize it in my research, because any worldview has a couple of questions that it answers, and these are basically philosophical questions. It's like, what am I? Right? What is the nature of reality? What is true and what is good? You answer those questions and you've got yourself a worldview. Okay. Right? So I kind of structured my characterization of it around those ideas. So what am I? Right? The way that they see themselves, the way that they perceive themselves is as fundamentally part of an ethnic group. First and foremost, like group is at the ground floor of identity of the self. Okay. They are parts of larger ethnic collectives. It's ethnocollectivism, basically, is the way that they see themselves. And this was, I used some analysis from a sociologist named Ian Wortham, who called it Ethno-Race Consciousness. And Ethno-Race Consciousness is basically that. It's a foundational, volitional level of awareness of oneself as fundamentally an ethnic group. So what am I? I am a part of the white group.
Okay.
Right. That's how they see the self. There isn't an I.
That white group has a value, right?
Yeah, there's
or a relative value or an intrinsic value, you think?
That's another part of this. I think the way that they see these groups, there's a sort of essence. I think they perceive these groups as having some sort of extrinsic essence.
Like blackness, whiteness.
That's exactly what it is. Yeah. So the black group isn't just the aggregate, like blackness isn't just the aggregate will of black people. It's not. There's something like blackness is a metaphysical ideal. I think that's the way they see it. It's this ideal of how it's this essence of black, right? And that what that essence is like, well, there's cognitive authority. There's like this legitimate perception of the world. There is sort of just revolution, reclamation, like just power. I think these are all parts of that ideal. And the way that I think this sort of manifests is that, like, when a black person doesn't uphold this sort of worldview, we hear like, we're pulling your black card, we're revoking your black, you're rejecting your blackness.
Yeah, Ta-Nehisi Coates' treatment of Kanye West.
Yeah, there you go.
Very explicit.
That's exactly right. Or I thought that's how they treated Les Perce at the Perce Hall building demonstration or building dedication.
Yeah.
They treated him quite poorly. They treated him like they would have treated any person, regardless of color of skin, I think. And I think that's because he wasn't embracing his blackness.
Okay.
And because blackness is a sort of ideal
of
it. Does that make sense?
Do you think, extrapolating just from this story, do you perceive their version of blackness having to do with pure rebellion against the power structure? Can the blackness ever be in a power structure, or are all power structures inherently an outgrowth of whiteness? Because there's this one Shamerica in the 4300 room, library room, kind of that first main struggle session. She says, all of our administrators are white. And this is how whiteness works. Whiteness is the most violent fucking system that's ever breathed. And the only way to solve it is through action, and that's why we're here, for action. So is there a way for blackness to be in power?
I think so. Within their worldview, yeah, I think their objection is to what they perceive as illegitimate power. I think they see the white power structure as ill-gotten.
Okay.
And yeah, because the way that they ordered themselves, the black students had the power. Like within the Evergreen group, the Evergreen tribe, the way paradigm I used.
Yeah.
It was the black students and the students of color who had authority. They were in power, and this was a good thing. Great. Grasping our identities, knowing our power. I think it was also Shamerica who said that. They can absolutely be in power, and it can be legitimate. I don't think power per se is bad.
Okay.
Yeah, to answer that question. They're certainly not egalitarians who want to undo like hierarchies. It's not that. It's just hierarchies.
Oh, okay.
That's what they want, is a just hierarchy.
That is really fascinating in the context of from the ideological place of the administrators and the faculty who are teaching things of equity. It seems like they are trying to not necessarily dismantle hierarchies themselves, but level everything. They really want to bring everybody up and everybody down to make a leveling. So it seems like from that administrator point of view, they're trying to correct the hierarchy by distributing power and resources evenly to create an equal outcome. But what you're describing here is that everything is a hierarchy, and the hierarchy must be implemented. And then how do you think that justifies their behavior? Why their behavior is an outgrowth of that conception of power?
Well, there's a way, they see that there is a just way that the world could be structured. The only reason it's not structured that way is because of oppression and oppression, broadly speaking.
Okay.
And that they can be the ones to justly order the world.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's a real sort of purity thing going on in the way that they talk and the way that they think. I think that because there's these two like ideals, blackness and whiteness, and blackness is this very positive, good ideal that parts of blackness, black people, should strive towards. Whereas whiteness is a negative. Ideal can be a negative thing, right? It's a negative ideal. It's something, it's oppression and privilege and theft and rape and violence and assimilation, and that needs to be actively sort of rejected.
Okay.
So in their discourse, you get this discourse of purity. It's like we need centering. That's what centering is. Centering is social and psychological purity. Of making sure that the space and the psyche is centered around the just
and authentic
thing, which is blackness, and rejecting the sort of malevolent negative influence of whiteness. So it's you get a real purity discussion going on.
Yeah.
And I think that feeds into what some other people are talking about this as, sort of framing it as a religion. That's very much so a religious way to think. Maybe not in Eastern religions, there's a lot of like purifying the self and purifying the society and things like that. So that suggests that the people who are looking at it that way might be right.
In a certain sense, the canoe meeting and then the day of absence, they operated on one level as kind of just community things, kind of hokey things that the college was doing, but because they relied on religious symbolism and ceremony, and because they approached things as a religious, in a religious attitude. Did you watch the canoe meeting?
Oh, yeah.
So you know the tone of that room. I was in that room. The tone was very, very thick, right? And then even though the day of absence, we can argue and meddle, did they want to be segregated? Did they want to kick white people off campus? But the fact that they did set that up to center the students of color implemented that on the level of the institution, that we are centering this group as sacred. They circled around at the end of the canoe meeting. They all walked out the door, and then they circled around the black students and they sang songs. So they literally summoned.
Wow.
That's not on film. That was just
wow. That's fascinating. The canoe. I spent a lot of time in the appendix of my research. There's a basically an interpretation of the canoe meeting. And I think it's there's a lot to it. I think it's really symbolic of the way that they see the world, right? It's the few things that I looked at were one was boarding permissions, because there was however many people, 15 or so people, who gave the spiel, why am I getting on? They said something before they boarded the canoe, right? Yeah. And I looked at it in terms of boarding permissions, in that who has permission to board, who gives permission to board, and who must request it, right?
Yeah.
And I can't remember the exact numbers, but there were no black students who requested permission.
They were ordered by Shamerica to get on.
Yeah, and then there was that, and then she invited physically, literally, all of the black students in the room to join the canoe.
Yeah, in front,
and in front of the canoe too, right? Now, if you know anything about a canoe, it'll tip, but
don't worry, it tipped.
It tipped, right? Yeah. All the black students get on the front of the canoe, and then there were people, and then the people who requested permission were always white students. Well, mostly faculty, white faculty. And then the people who gave permission were always students of color. Okay. That's not irrelevant, right? I know it's a small sample size. It's like 17 people, but it's not irrelevant that a certain group of people had to ask to get on and another group of people gave permission. Okay. That's not irrelevant. I think that's very symbolic of the way that they see the world. And then, the black students get on front of the canoe, and then they lead the entire, group of
campus.
They lead the campus.
They say the professors in the one after the main protest, when they justify the students, say that the students led us. The students are leading us, which is an interesting question. Like, did you not put them up to do that? So are you leading the leaders? With regards to a couple of actors and stuff like that.
I think that's part of the political story here, is that you do have like leaders in the institution who are sort of fostering this. That's definitely there.
Do you think that the May uprising was inevitable? Do you think that things were put in place, and how do you make sense of it as an event?
Oh, was it inevitable? Well, I think a lot of things came together to make this happen. If Trump lost the election, do you think this would have happened? I don't know. Maybe, because that's a pretty world-shattering. If you think that there's no chance that he wins, and he's the incarnation of pure evil, and he wins, it's going to rip your world apart, and it obviously did. The canoe meeting was like a week after the election. Yeah. That's a part of this. There was the police shooting of, I think it was 2 black brothers off campus.
Andre and Bryson.
Yeah.
But that was in 2015.
Right, yeah. But that's still like in the ether, right? That's a part of it. And then Brett, he was a stick in the mud about this thing. He objected to it. He wasn't going along with it. So now you have this, you have, the world is like unstable because Trump's elected, right? You have these,
images of violence.
Images of violence, yeah. I actually think the fact that they're in Olympia, it's a place like this, plays a role in it as well. Because I'm just driving around and looking at things and looking at people, and you have this somewhat progressive like center surrounded by more conservative, there's white guys with goatees and trucks with caps on driving trucks around. Like that's a sketchy image for someone who might have come from a city into here.
Yeah.
So that context is a part of it. And then Brett, he becomes like an icon of the opposition, right? Because he says, I'm not going to do this.
Why is that so galvanizing for you?
Oh, because having opposition is amplifying. Right? Because you have something to fight against. You have an enemy. There's an enemy at the gate. There's someone who it's not this amorphous thing of badness. It's like, it has a face, it has a classroom, it has an address. You can symbolically slay the dragon, That's why. Opposition is very amplifying. And that's what Brett was, I think.
Why do you think they what's your take on their treatment of George Bridges, then? And then his response to that. How do you make sense of that? Because he was giving them everything they wanted, and they kept on pillaring him.
I really feel bad for George Bridges. Yeah. Watching all this footage, I got a lot of sympathy for him. Before I did this project, I kind of thought, he's a bit of a schmuck. He's just an actor in this, I feel really, really bad for that guy, because you can see that he's trying to do what he thinks is right. That's got to count for something. But these people, I don't think he gets the whole worldview. I think he understands some of it, but he's learning as he goes along. Because I don't think he sees that I think he probably has an older view of the self. Like, I'm an individual that has some sort of racial modifiers, that privilege and things like that, and I need to work on that. But they see him as white people. So I think there was a little bit of a little bit of misunderstanding, lost in translation there. Why did they keep treating him like that? Man, part of this might not have anything to do with the worldview. Part of it just might be that if you make it okay for people to abuse people, they might. Some people are psychopaths. Some people just like abusing people that they can get away with abusing. And they really, I mean, I don't think it's a stretch to say that those students abused George Bridges. I don't think that's a stretch to say. What do you think? Are you... Oh, Kitty on... Did she stop the recording?
No, don't do that. Here, you go up there.
Oh. What do you think, George?
I'm almost done with my report, and I have to say this out loud so I don't forget it. I want to know what you think the students want.
Okay.
Because people watch my documentary like, but what do they want? I'm like, well, they want what they want. I have a problem with Bridges because he changes shape depending on who he's speaking to, and he's not very consistent from one group to the next. He's always playing towards winning. So I don't see him as a truthful person. Mm-hmm. There's too many lies. Mm-hmm. So I have a hard time having respect for him. And plus, the report that comes out a year after the protests was independent report staffed by people that he knew for 20 years that completely praised him and admonished Brett Weinstein. Blamed it all on Brett Weinstein and Charlottesville, which happened three months later. So there's too many things for me to really see it clearly. So what I'm trying to do is get into the position where I can be kind of objective and do one episode just concentrating on his behavior through the whole thing so we can see what I perceive of as inconsistency. But he's playing at another game, and I think he's playing through a bureaucratic mindset that he's got bosses, and he's a boss, and so he's part of a chain of command, and it's a part of this whole machinery of Washington State. I think he's a piece of the Washington State machinery, which works all the way up to the governor and the legislature. So there's so many moving parts that we don't really know, like the grand plan. And he's running some plan you never know. So that's the only way I can make sense of inconsistencies, is that he's got a higher ideal.
There's a higher aim to it, and he's playing politics as he can to get to that. That very well might be the case. Yeah. And maybe he's betting that he can get the energy of these students. He can be at the front of it as a good guy, right? He can be a symbol of good with this lots of energetic students behind him, and maybe he's just gambling on that. Yeah. Could be. I don't know. That's interesting.
So, what do you think the students wanted?
Yeah, hard to. I mean, there's a couple of answers to that. A lot of times they say what they want. We want to get rid of the police. We want to disarm the police. We want to get them off campus. We want Brett to be fired. We want to hire more faculty of color. Oh, Kitty's going to stop it again.
Why do you have to be in one place you're not supposed to be?
A very critical producer you have. Yeah, like I said.
So there are these individual asks that they have, but what do you think is the desire or the end goal of the movement? Have you seen that? Do you have or is it just the manifestation of a morality that they're playing?
I think it's more of that. I think it's more of that. I think this is just the way that their social order is bound to manifest based on the foundations of their belief system. That's just the way that it would manifest. And what they want is to express... They want to express the belief system implicated... They want to express the society implicated by their belief system.
Okay.
That's what I think. Does it have an aim? Yeah, maybe the aim is the manifestation of that belief system.
Okay.
That society implicated, which would look like...
What would it look like?
Yeah, it wouldn't look good. I don't think it would look good at all. You have... I mean, what I would describe, it would sound tyrannical and racist. It's a society where positions of power are occupied by people based on the color, because they have the right skin color, and that another group of people has to live for that other group.
So the allies... The ally is not the correct term. They would be serfs?
Serfs, yeah, right, maybe serfs.
Is that what you see?
I mean...
Would the the end goal be segregation or some sort of apartheid?
I mean,
with a dominant and a subdominant group?
Like, yeah, if this was fully played out, it would be massively segregated. Like, maybe this is a better way to put it. If this way of seeing the world is fully mainstreamed, right? I know it's leaking out into, I think a lot of what we see today is kind of like this. If this is fully mainstreamed, if this is deeply embedded in educational institutions and in pedagogy and in government, and if this is just like the way that the world, or let's say the country, goes, that's the end of pluralism. It's the end of the American melting pot, right? You can't get along with people if you separate people, if people aren't individuals and people are only parts of larger ethnic collectives that have particular moral status based on the history of their ethnic group. That you can't have pluralism, right? If you and I were of different races, we couldn't be friends, right? We couldn't even talk to each other. And if you have a worldview like that, I don't see how any kind of peaceful society is sustained. I'm quite pessimistic about it. Because I think there's some people who kind of laugh about this in Evergreen, who it's like, well, the left eats itself.
Yeah.
Right? The left, they'll eat themselves. It's like, they might, but they're going to eat everybody else first. They have to eat all through the right and the center and then the moderate left before they start eating themselves. So I don't take, cold comfort in that. Yeah.
Huh. And do you have an idea of where it came from or kind of the origin of that? And you don't have to go through the whole James Lindsay and Helen Pluckroth things, but what do you think? Okay, what are some of the core animating principles? I think you've already laid them down, but you said that it's based in this conception of the ethnic group as an essential property of a person that has relative moral weight, and so that should be eroded through this process that we call equity. Is that?
I think equity is the. If we're looking at it like a religion, that's the scripture, right? That's like the way that they describe what they believe in a sort of the content, right? That's the moral content described. How did they get here? I'm not sure. I'm not sure how we got here. This is a question that I'm interested in doing some future research on, because I think there's some like cultural evolution, and like the James Lindsay, Helen Pluckroth thing. I think they get quite a lot right. I think a lot of these ideas are transmitted through teachers. That's not a particularly. That's obvious, kind of. But I also think there is something going on with social media. I think that's playing that's a part of how these ideas are spreading, and how they're, in my view, kind of getting crude. There's a crudeness to the ideas. They're not particularly nuanced.
Yeah, no.
And I can't help but think that social media plays a role in that, because you're seeing the other not as this full sort of human, with individual traits and characteristics. You're seeing him as like, Trump supporter, white guy, black guy, and the crudeness of this worldview seems to reflect that. So I think that's part of the story, but I'm not quite sure how we got here.
Trolls and snowflakes.
It's all trolls.
The end of the West.
The end of the West. Yeah, right.
There was another question. Did you get a chance to look through the social media aspect of it? And I haven't been able to pull everything up, but what do you perceive the social media role was in that?
I coded some social media posts. I think that social media, here's one mechanism in social media, and the idea is networks. So you can have a closed network or an open network. So an open network is where people within the network, they don't all know each other, right? Like, I know you and you know 10 people, and I know 10 people, but our 10 people don't know each other. It's an open network. Closed network is where you and I know each other, and everyone we know also knows each other. Yeah. I think social media makes people, makes closed networks, right? Because everyone here, they all know each other, they all know each other's names, what they say, what they do, where they go to school.
Yeah.
And what a closed network does is it increases the cost of norm violation. Because if that network has some sort of norm, like this world, like the worldview has loads of norms, and if you violate that norm, everyone you know will come down on your head. You know no one else. Everyone, you have no other friend group to go to, right? The entire world will come down on your head. If you have an open network and someone says, I think what you said was terrible, you say, well, that sucks, but I'm going to go hang out with my other buds, right? Yeah. So that's a mechanism in social media, is that I think that occurred at Evergreen, is that network became really closed and really tight. Okay. And then as soon as those norms started getting violated, major sanctions started coming down on Brett, right?
Yeah.
Other people.
Yeah, and Cammack.
Yes.
What do you think is the aspect of having do you know of any literature about this, about certain closed groups or communities that have a high moral kind of aptitude or a very strong moral reflex to it? Because it seems like at the Evergreen State College, one thing that caused it to get so rowdy was that there was a really strong moral reflex. There was a right and a wrong. Is that always to be the case in certain things? And what are the aspects that lead a community towards that place?
Well, that's very often the case. There's loads of very small, insular, thick ethnic communities all across the world, but all across.
Thick is a technical term.
Thick, yeah. So culturally thick. There's the belief system. Tells you quite a lot. It's deeply embedded in everything you do. Yada yada yada. Okay. As opposed to our thin liberal, a la carte culture, right?
Waspy, weird,
right. Stuff. Yeah. So there's the Kiryas Joel Jewish community in New York is an example of that. It's a really Orthodox Jewish community. There's loads of Orthodox Jewish communities around. The Amish are an example of this. Plenty others. And I think this is an example of that, of these small insular ethnic communities. Certainly, they almost always have a strong moral grounding in something, and that shapes everything else that they do, or informs everything else that they do. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think if people want to live like that, that's their choice. I'm a very permissive kind of pluralist, like you do you. Mm-hmm. The problem is when that kind of morality tries to become everything, you get a problem. Those small communities need to be options within a larger pluralistic framework.
Okay.
If that makes sense. So people at the Evergreen thing, if you want to live that way, live that way. If that's the way you want to see the world, that's fine. You can see the world that way.
Yeah.
But the line has to be drawn with, you can't make me see the world your way. I have to be able to choose my own life as well.
Okay.
And that's pluralism. That's just how.
That's interesting, because that was operative in my experience there, is that we had to see the world this way. You had to see this world, or you had to at least go through the motions of seeing the world this way. You couldn't actually disagree with that worldview. It was constantly being proposed and proposed and proposed and proposed. And I really do think that they should just take that liberal part out of the arts, and just kind of put that aside, because it's no longer liberal at that point when you are Orthodox. It's maybe an Orthodox arts college, or
it's a very
social justice Orthodox.
Yeah, it's a very unsophisticated way to think about diversity. It's people are different skin colors, therefore we're diverse. It's but they all think, you're making them all think the same. Yeah. That's not diversity. And I suspected that that's how it was there at Evergreen, and that's very unfortunate. And because when it starts doing that, I don't think it
can stop.
It amplifies, right? Because that minority, let's say it's 60% of them have this worldview and they're really loud about it, and you have this quiet minority who's fine, whatever, I'll play the motions. That minority gets smaller and smaller. That's why I'm a big proponent of viewpoint diversity. You need someone who disagrees. You need conservatives in liberal institutions, and you need, progressives in conservative institutions, because otherwise these institutions often creep towards totalitarianism if the principles underlying it aren't like consciously about pluralism and viewpoint diversity.
Do you think that it's possible for the same sort of situation to work out without it being based on... Let me rephrase this.
Yeah.
Because you said, when you were kind of describing how this thing is built, you said it's based on this ethnic essentialism, or this racial essentialism, which just doesn't seem like a good idea to me. But it's still, at the same time, it's very attractive, and they really push that in all the trainings. It's like, I am privileged because of white. I'm underprivileged because of black. And the race thing was one aspect of it, because there was other identities that got power and privilege in that whole thing.
Yeah.
Disability status and trans status.
Well, what I saw, and you tell me what you think, I don't think that any aspect of identity transcends the fundamental division between POC and non-POC, the way that I saw them operating. I don't think anything transcends that. I think those are modifiers, right? Like a within class modifier, like you can have a high status, low class person. So like, let's say a gay white person.
Yeah.
Or a low status POC, let's say a straight Hispanic guy or something. But I didn't see anything that transcended that. It's not like there's ever a gay white guy who can like wag his finger at a black woman, or a gay black guy. Like, it never.
Unless the black person wanted to go into the science building, or unless the black person was acting white.
So that's actually really. I'm really glad you bring that up.
Which is horrible to say, but this is actually
no.
True.
Yeah.
This is actually how it works.
That's how they see. Yeah. And the way that I kind of wrap my head around this is. Let me make a very somewhat controversial parallel to the Indian caste system.
Okay.
Right. Now, I don't want to say that this is a caste system strictly, but you have the sort of in-group caste, right? And there's levels of the lower level and then the higher level, Brahmins and what have you. But all of that sits atop the outcast, which is the lower level group of people who aren't in the caste system, right? I think that shape is going on here, because you have in-caste people, and then you have outcast people, which are blacks who go to the science building, or who don't reject whiteness, or who are, let's say, conservative, like,
or just say, I'm not oppressed,
something like that. Like, you're an outcast now. So you're right. It can be transcended as when that person doesn't buy into the belief system. Then that person is just an outcast, and the whole pyramid sits atop that. And I think that's actually, someone asked me a very good question early in this research, which was, why would any white guy do this?
Yeah.
Right? And as and I'm interested in rational choice and things like that. So that's a pretty, why would he choose that? It doesn't seem particularly rational to do that. It doesn't seem like just doesn't seem to bring him any utility. It doesn't seem to be very good for you to buy into that. So it took a while, but I think the answer is yes. You're at the bottom of this hierarchy. You're at the bottom of this pyramid, but the pyramid sits atop the world. Right, that's why. Is because, you're low status, but you're low status atop the rest of the unwashed, uneducated masses that you have moral status over, and you can educate, and you can largely hate, and you can, anyways. I think that's why. It's because it's not actually at the bottom, it's the bottom at the top.
The redeemed ally kind of thing.
Yeah. It's also a good narrative.
What do you mean?
I mean, everyone loves the reformed Nazi. Right, everyone. Right, it's like
the male feminist.
Yeah. It's because I used to be that, but now I do that, and it's good to reform Nazis. Don't get me wrong, but that I was on their side. Now I'm here. It's a defector narrative kind of thing. Like the North Koreans love those couple of Americans who defected to North Korea. They're heroes, right? Because it's a great narrative. It's a great story, and it is.
Can this become stable? It was unstable at Evergreen. It's we look at Portland and Seattle, and we see a lot of the aspects, like Chaz fell apart. These democratic cities are falling apart. It seems like they're the ones who are most likely to implement this. Do you think that it could be stabilized? Do you think that it's possible?
No, because you have to force people to believe things. I don't think you can do that.
Like what? What do you have to force them to do?
Like you have to force someone into taking guilt for something he doesn't think that he's done, right?
Okay.
That's a hard sell to a lot of people. It's engineered. It's very engineered. And I don't think any system that is any social system that is engineered, like has this really set, like force to make everything one way, I don't think that ever works. I think social systems have to be emergent, not engineered.
Okay, I'm going to push against that because you look at the West Coast school system, and they are implementing this stuff right now. They're teaching children, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds and on, that here's the caste system. The Black Lives Matter, which doesn't just mean Black Lives Matter. It's packaged with all this oppression, white privilege. Privilege is kind of like I guess that's the gateway drug to this thing. Like, accept your privilege. So how do you see it playing out if there's if you grew up with this stuff, how would that eventually manifest in anxiety or in purpose? Do you have any guesses in that?
Right. Yeah. No, that's a really good point. Like if everyone was forced to go into mandatory equity education, everyone would probably believe that, and there would be a small minority of people who didn't. What does that do for people? I definitely think there's real serious mental issues that will go along with thinking that you're one of the worst things that's ever existed. And that's what this is, because in my research I call this Ethno-Historical Determinism. And the idea is that it is not the content of your character, but the character of the history of your ethnicity that determines your virtue.
Okay.
Right? So what that means is I'm responsible for slavery. I did that. Not someone who looked like me. I actually carry the weight of that. And all sorts of other terrible, terrible things that a mostly white government did do to minorities. I did that. That's not going to be good for people's mental health, to walk through the world thinking they've done all this. That's not going to be good for people's mental health at all. But beyond that...
does it benefit the people who now can justify their lower status by saying that it's the white man's fault? Does it create harmony in the mental health of the people who buy into the victim narrative?
Maybe. Does the... what's it called when you've done a sin, but you get it absolved?
Yeah, absolution.
Does the absolution actually have some sort of psychological, piecing, some sort of good psychological effect? Maybe. I don't know. It could. I'm worried that it wouldn't for a lot of people.
So when did you submit your dissertation?
My thesis. I submitted it earlier this month.
Oh, okay.
Earlier this month, yeah.
But you were working on it come May 26th or so, like that.
Of this year?
Yeah, you were just holed away in the library.
Oh, yeah. I've been working on this project since November of last year.
Okay, yeah.
Because I had to get my data, I had to process the data, which took me 4 months of sitting at my computer just coding. And then I wrote for 2.5 months maybe. And then, and I was holed away, just writing.
What happened when you looked outside and Chicago was burning and the world was...
See, I told you.
Hey, ho, ho.
Yeah, right.
What did that do to you? How did that feel when it...
Oh, not good. Not good. I would really...
Did you see a lot of similarities?
Yes. Yeah. So I was in Chicago, the University of Chicago is in Hyde Park, which is a little suburb just south of the main city. And most of the protests were kept to city center, but some came down to Hyde Park where I was. So I was watching the protests on TV because there were news, and they came right outside my building. And what was really weird was some of the language, that I saw at Evergreen, like guys who were smashing buildings were saying, like they were talking about white privilege, right? Which only really existed, I think, as far as I know, only really existed in like academia or like elite liberal white liberals, right? That was kind of a word that they used a lot, and it was in academia. But to see just these like Chicago dudes who aren't in academia, who aren't white liberals, using this same language, it's like, wow, this got all the way down to the bottom. And I'm really not excited about that. I'm very worried.
Huh. Do you have any like inklings of advice to navigate this time for people, or insight? How have you decided to go about taking your lesson and like retrofitting it to this? You might even not need to do too much retrofitting, because it seems to me, but I'm very prejudiced because I'm steeped in this stuff. When this happened in June, I'm like, oh my God. Like I was receiving emails showing that the same training is now being installed that I had to go through, and the same protests are going on. Like, well, what do I do now? How do I...
The whole world got in the canoe, and now it's sinking. What do you do now?
Yeah, what do you do? Dude,
I don't know, man.
Can we at least make sense of what's happening, and how would we make sense of it using the tool of this ethno-determinism?
Yeah, ethno-historical. The things that I think really make today's sort of what's going on today make sense are it's Ethno-Race Consciousness and Ethno-Historical Determinism, right? Which is basically just parts of Ethno-Collectivism. It's very collectivistic.
Okay.
And you can understand it that way. It's like, oh yes, these people see themselves as fundamentally their ethnic group. And the moral virtue of them today is based on the history of that ethnic group, which isn't new, and it's not left. It's not particularly it's not only a left-wing phenomenon. Mm-hmm. This is the same thing that the far-right guys, the white nationalist types, they do. It's pretty damn similar. Mm-hmm. So we can understand it that way, but like once we understand it, now what do we do?
Yeah.
Well, you need people like you who are critical of this. It needs to be okay to be critical of this, and the only way that happens is if more people are critical of it. It's like I don't consider myself. I'm not going to take the weight of all the ill things that white people have ever done. That's not my fault, and I'm okay saying that. I'm not Andrew Jackson. Things like that and criticisms of this worldview need to be okay to be said. So this is where critics really come in and are important. But I think that I don't know how. Like I said, I'm kind of a pessimist. I'm not very optimistic about where we go from here, because, like you said, California. It's in pedagogy, right? Yeah. How do you stop that? It's in pedagogy.
They're voting. They brought it up to vote in this fall. The legislature, they want to take anti-discrimination out of the law and say so it's okay for us to discriminate based on race.
Yeah,
for equity.
Of course, because you have to in order to make a just society. Okay. You have to discriminate against certain people because those people are bad, right? In the same way that we throw criminals in jail, we discriminate against them, but they've done something bad.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
If I had kids, I'd be homeschooling my kids. I'm not saying I wouldn't be sending my kids to any institution that teaches this. I would be seriously, if I was a parent with college age kids, I'd be seriously questioning, should you send your kids to college? There's other things kids can do. There's lots of other things they can do that are great for them.
Yeah.
If it's just work or apprentice or do after I graduated undergrad, I taught English abroad, and you can do that without a college degree. In Vietnam, you can do that. But where do we put in the intervention? Man, I really don't know. unfortunately, I think we're going to have to see lots and lots of negative consequences of this kind of belief. I think there's going to be more riots. There's going to be more issues. There's going to be a lot more people killed. There's going to be a lot more discrimination cases. The Yale, discrimination against Asians and whites, that thing. There's going to be a lot more of that. There's going to be more lawsuits. And maybe it's the law that finally has some sort of suppressing force, because if the law is you can't discriminate. I know they're trying to change that.
Yeah.
But use the law, sue people. This is America, baby. Sue their pants off. But other than that, I'm not sure where interventions can kind of come in. It's tough. It's really tough.
How was the University of Chicago? If you gave it an equity grade or a social justice grade, did you feel like you had academic freedom?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look what I researched. Absolutely. And I won't tell you about them, but I have colleagues doing research that is the most radioactive research I could possibly imagine them doing. Anybody doing.
Does it rhyme with I and Q?
Yeah, there you go. Yes, it does.
Yeah.
And, brilliant researchers doing really interesting research, not like, malevolent mustache twist.
Well, why not? A little bit of that.
Why not a little bit, right? No, and it's... No, you can basically research anything, no matter how controversial it is at UC, which is good.
Excellent.
I don't think that's true in every department. Like, a lot of my research was done under, like, kind of within the sociology folks, because a lot of it's sociological, and that I got a lot of pushback from them, particularly about some of the ways I described that. Like, some of the feedback I got on some of my drafts, and I really love this person who I worked with, who gave me this feedback. But some of the feedback would be like, I'd say something like, they see the world X way, and then the margin, the comment would be, yeah, and what's wrong with that, more or less. It's like, well, no, hang on. Yeah, but broadly, UC's really, really good. Now, will it always be that way? No. No, I don't think it'll be that way at all.
It's coming down the pipes then, you think?
Yeah, because institutions don't have principles. People do. And an institution only has principles insofar as its constituent members uphold those.
Yeah.
And the big free speech and academic, open inquiry, academic freedom folks, they're older.
Yeah.
They're older, like established academics. And they're going to retire. And the people that I see coming on board, with some exceptions, are not particularly into this. So I don't think UC... I mean, UC it's the bulwark of academic inquiry and open expression and free expression, and that's why I went there. But it won't be that way. I'm worried that it'll be gone in 10 or 20 years. I think it'll be like anywhere else.
I do see, and somebody might eventually write about this, but I do think that Evergreen was kind of at the forefront of a lot of this stuff. And part of the forefront was the regime change. They kind of accelerated just the way that the hiring practices happen. They kind of accelerated and refreshed that old liberal guard with the more radical guard sooner than other institutions.
Yep. And I think that's the way it goes in a lot of places. You have particularly in, like, you have diversity. They're called different things, but like a diversity. A department, council. University of Chicago has one.
Yeah.
It's huge. The building is pristine. There's so much money spent on this.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, really cool.
I guess I studied the wrong thing.
Yeah. And I think when you replace, because this, I mean, it almost seems like if I was conspiratorial, I would think there's a cabal of social justice types pulling the levers, because it almost seems that way, because it's getting into education and it's getting into hiring practices.
Yeah.
And if you educate people only in a certain way and you only hire people who believe a certain thing, then the whole fucking thing is going to go that direction.
Yeah.
I'm not a conspiracy theorist.
No, they've done really good. Whether intentionally or not, they really set us up for success.
It's impressive. Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
So what are you going to do now that you have such a master's degree?
Yeah, well, I'm applying to. Right now, I'm writing a research proposal for another PhD program. Hopefully, that comes through. Still around culture and the development of culture and cultural psychology. We'll see what happens there. But right now, what happens next, we'll see. I sadly suffer the end of Western civilization with the rest of us, I guess. I don't know. Hopefully, I would like to keep talking more about these ideas, and because unfortunately, and I want to, and I think you've been good at this, is like making this kind of discussion legitimate. Like, it's legitimate to have a real intellectual conversation about the implications of social justice warrior ideology, if that's what we want to call it. Because 4 years ago it was like SJW cringe compilations, right? And it was a joke. It was a joke. But I think it's become legitimate to talk about it, and I think that's a conversation I would like to keep being a part of. And I write op-eds and articles, kind of talking about this in different ways, trying to analyze stuff. And I hope to keep doing stuff like that, but we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens.
Are you adjacent to some problematic? What's the most problematic adjacency?
Oh, I'm deeply problematic.
No, you're not even adjacent. Keep it inside.
Yeah, right. I'm not some like far right guy. I'm a big umbrella libertarian. I'm a voluntarist. I think action should be voluntary, and then my politics come down from there. My most problematic stuff is just about I think you should be free to own like lots of weapons, and I think you should be free to do meth, or I think you should be free to be a prostitute. And that's problematic to all different sides.
You're just pissed off everybody. 30 to 50% of the audience, just right there.
Yeah, right. That's my problematic stuff, but I don't. I don't want to just be some provocateur or someone who upsets people. My point is, I'm really genuinely interested in this stuff. And I've got my own politics, but I just want to understand the way that this is going, because now I think I kind of get it. I just didn't get it, and maybe that's a little bit of like social ineptitude on my part, that I just didn't quite grab me like I think it, like Evergreen, like it didn't quite, or the that sort of equity ideology. It didn't just that makes sense. No, it was like, whoa, what is this? I don't get this. Yeah. So now I think I understand it, and I want to keep trying to understand.
Do you think that Evergreen is a legitimate data point in explaining this ideology to people, or do you think it's a complete outlier?
It's neither. It's neither a complete outlier, and it's neither a world in it. Yeah, it's not the world in a teacup, right? Okay. I want to be pretty careful about generalizing out from this, because this is one thing that happened in 2016, 2017, with a couple hundred people. Like, I can't tell you the story of the universe based on that, right? But I think there are insights from Evergreen that are useful for understanding other things. And the cluster of ideas that I characterize in my research, maybe that's useful for understanding other sort of campus events. Like, if there is Ethno-Race Consciousness, maybe there's also Ethno-Historical Determinism, because they're interdependent. So maybe it helps us understand other things. But yeah, it's a good little case study of a kind of thinking really fully explicated and manifest socially in the proximal society. But I don't necessarily think we can understand all of America. Yeah. America isn't Evergreen, and I hope it continues to not be.
I'll pour beer to that, but outside. Cool. Thanks for doing that work. Thanks for legitimizing me.
Well, yeah.
I feel so validated.
Well, I mean, I really do appreciate your work. Like, I couldn't have. You collected all this footage, and that's huge. Like my research couldn't have happened without that. So I'm really grateful that you did that, and you're very gracious to share it with me also, because I know that's a thing. And I hope it continues to be legitimized. Because this is a really interesting phenomenon. Mm-hmm. Whether you agree with it or disagree with it, it's a really interesting thing that's happening in small pockets like Evergreen, and there's broader trends going on also. Yeah. It's fascinating, and we shouldn't just chalk it up to politics, or we shouldn't just chalk it up to like radical students run amok, or we shouldn't even like. I'm kind of even a little critical, and I really hesitate to say this because I love their work and I love their book. And everything, I'm a big fan of theirs, is Lukianoff and Haidt's Coddling of the American Mind. Yeah. It's a great book. But I worry that I don't want to medicalize this way of seeing the world. Because a lot of their way of thinking is, it's like, well, they're catastrophizing. There's cognitive sort of, maybe cognitive pathologies at play here. And that's where this sort of, what this worldview is, or things like that. And I hesitate to go down that path fully with them, because I think it delegitimizes their world, the worldview of, like, social justice ideology, or whatever you want to call it. Yeah. Because it's a real way of seeing the world. They really see the world that way. Yeah. And maybe there are certainly consequences to that way of seeing the world. We talk about anxiety. Haidt and Lukianoff talk about all sorts of issues that happens with it. And those are real, but it's not just that. It's not just like a cognitive, issue, and then you have this. It's legitimate.
Yeah, I have an interview coming out soon with sexologist Dr. James Cantor, and he got into a row on a listserv where he posted something. This is a completely different conversation. Okay. It's called the Turf War, and J.K. Rowling's involved. This trans
I'm
stuff.
familiar.
Okay.
Right.
So he just posted a kind of. Well, the writing wasn't milquetoast, but it was kind of just like, we can't use the word turf to describe all these points of view. Just like we can't describe transition as just one thing. There's all these different conditions to it. And he just like put that out there, and then he started getting blowback from the radical trans rights activists who saw this as perpetuating harm. And there's this whole email chain, just like at Evergreen, this whole email chain where it's not about race, it's about this identity. I got to this one email, and it was just, I thought it was a parody, because she was saying everything that Jamil said, everything that Naima said about, like, I'm reading this and it is literally violence to me. Like, this stuff actually takes my identity and destroys it before my eyes. And like, she's going over and over, and how I don't want to hear anything back from you because I know my experience, and there's nothing that you can do with your science to tell me what I'm really feeling about this, So basically, long story short, shut the fuck up, like, which is a refrain at Evergreen that they say over and over and over again. Like, they'll just end the conversation, they'll terminate you in a lot of different ways. So and we could describe that way of behavior as narcissistic sociopathy or some sort of histrionic personality disorder. But in the context of the group, there's something that's enabling these people to rise up into power and then behave that way without shame. And then nobody is allowed to, say, well, that is not proper at all, right? So this ideology might facilitate certain sorts of narcissistic sociopathy, but I think that that's a kind of a consequence to a foundational principle. And I think it even possibly enables that people to act that way, and that might be like where that social media influence comes in, where we're really concentrating on identity as this thing that is seen and validated by other people.
I think that's exactly right. And I'm not too familiar with the turf wars. Is that the way it's?
I guess so.
Yeah, the turf wars. Yeah. I'm not too familiar with it.
But that's why I moved on from Evergreen to that, because there was the similar behavior around the activist social justice mindset. And they were, instead of taking race, which I needed to get away from because it's a very depressing narrative that you have to steep yourself in. Because there's a lot of really terrible stuff that these kids are like being shown about the history. And we can't just erase history, even though I'm not going to be guilty for it. Like, I need to understand that. And how do you process that information? The tools that they're given to process this stuff, I don't think are proper.
No, they're exacerbating it. The tools that they're given they exacerbate these sorts of these feelings. The trauma. Yeah, that's exactly right. Grasping our identities, identity development. That phrase, I think Cammack has said that, or some other people have, and I've seen that come up. Identity development, or like, what does that mean? Identity development, and I think what it means is learning how to think of yourself as this big thing.
Oh, okay.
I think that's what they mean by identity development.
So instead of emerging into a self, you're emerging into your group consciousness.
Yeah,
then.
race consciousness.
Wow.
Yeah. I think that's what it is.
Wow.
And Ann Wortham and Ayn Rand, they talk about this as an issue of self-esteem. They think that you're filling up your lack of individual being with group consciousness, with group identity. You think that you're standing on the shoulders of giants, right? You're riding on their coattails is what you're doing. You're filling yourself up with this narrative of you're taking other people's because that's the other thing. You're taking other people's accomplishments
and traumas.
Yeah. And I think that, particularly because I'm interested in ethno-collectivism, sometimes this points me over to the right also. And when I've done research on far right types, particularly white nationalists, they look back at the history of Europe, right? Yeah. They look back at democracy and Shakespeare and what have you, and they say, I did that.
Yeah. I created penicillin.
I did that. Yeah. I did that.
Yeah.
And it's you're a fucking loser, sitting in your basement, whatever. You didn't do that. But because they're a loser in their basement, their self-esteem is propped up with other people's accomplishments. So that's how Ayn Rand and Ann Wortham often think about this. Is an issue of self-esteem. And I think there's something to that.
Yeah.
Because your self is... there's no self. You're this...
Body.
That's further research that should definitely be done. People definitely... I was going to do it, but I didn't have time to look into body. That's a whole rabbit hole. Body and work. The work.
Yeah, the work.
The work.
Kamala just said that.
Did she really?
She said, there's no vaccine to racism. We must do the work.
The work.
And
what does that
Evergreen.
No. Evergreen flashbacks. Yeah, that one, in my first draft, I had a section outlined for the work. But I didn't have time to get into it.
Wow.
But the work...
That's the eschatology. That's the future. It's it's never ending. Phyllis F. Esposito in the 2016 canoe meeting. This never ends. Right, we have to constantly do this. As soon as you think you're done, it's not a destination. There's no plan to do this.
It's just perpetual toil
suffrage.
Towards and I think any researchers out there, that's a good project to go into. Look at the work, capital T, capital W, the work. And I think that tends to, because there's people who are looking at this as a religion. That's the religious paradigm. I think John McWhorter. Yeah, he said he's going to write a book about it.
Yeah. That's how I came out of the gate swinging. I'm this is a theology. This is not a theory.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely something to that. It's not a theory. It's a
story. It's a narrative.
It's a grand narrative. What's a religion? A religion is a moral framework. It's a grand narrative, and it's a way of seeing the world, right?
And behaving in it.
And behaving in it with practices that elaborate all of that. Because religion practices. If that's your definition of religion, Church of Evergreen, man. It seems like it. But I think the work is that kind of captures that religious kind. If I was more religious, I'd be able to have... if I was religious at all, I'd be able to tell you I'll have to go ask my very religious girlfriend about what the parallel would be with the work. Missionary stuff, I don't know. I think that kind of analysis is good, and I think that kind of analysis will elaborate quite a lot of this.
Yeah, there's just a way of speaking that the adherents to this ideology adopt. And it's in their phraseology and it's in their tone. And you can hear it through their clicky keyboards or their touch typing interfaces. There's these way of making a phrase that really lends itself to some sort of religious consciousness, or it's like a programming that they're using that it's very crude. It's very big capitals, very allegorical. It's like they're living in some sort of allegory land where everything is really these chunky cartoons and you can make sense of everything, and any deviation from that is somehow apologized for, or like either swept away or canceled or relegated to the outcast in a way. It's a very...
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly... Yeah, and we're talking about like the nuance, like the lack of nuance.
Yeah, the lack of nuance.
It's clunky. It's very clunky. And you're right, the way of talking, the way of structuring sentences, all sorts of signaling they do.
Yeah.
Which a lot of people do. That's not them. Yeah. That's just a thing that humans do, you know.
But it seems like, I guess this is kind of the point I'm going for, it seems like it's regressive to an earlier stage of development, in a sense. It's kind of like this, kind of like a YA book kind of way of seeing the world. Like, it's childish, it's chunky, it's cartoonish, everything's a caricature. There's not a lot of individuality in it, and it's just interesting to me wondering about why that is taking hold of people. Maybe because it's so accessible for everybody to be in. It's a way of belonging in this world that is so alienating, perhaps.
Yeah.
We're so
I mean, we are disconnected, and I think this is a criticism that a lot of like people way to my right make of liberalism and libertarianism, that it's this culture destroying force. It's this atomizing. Yeah. It rips.
It's not thick enough.
It's not thick enough. It's too thin. We're pulled too thin, and it rips our culture and our history, and now we just become these atomized, floating individuals. Like, and then we fill that hole with whatever we can. And maybe that's pop culture, but maybe it's this sort of like activism thing that fills you up. Now, I don't think I disagree with a lot of what they say, but if you are someone who feels like they don't have a history, they don't have their culture is gone, they don't really have much to like embed themselves in.
Yeah.
You're going to be attracted to something that gives you a way of orienting yourself in reality.
Yeah.
And which this does. It gives you like good and bad. Here's what you can do. Here's where you are. Here's your place in the hierarchy. Like, you know everything you need to know about reality. And it is clunky. It's slightly, maybe cartoonish is right. And maybe that's just because that's very easy for people to grasp. I think a lot of it has to do with social media. How nuanced can you be in 280 words, with emojis and what have GIFs. So there's this really like, it's a compression. There's a lot of compression going on with these ideas, and you just get these like representatives that aren't real. Like, that's not quite right, but that's like, it's good enough to make your worldview work, I guess.
And let me just look at that.
Sure.
Why were you, in your own development as a thinker, why did you end up going down the path? I guess libertarianism is this kind of thing, maybe some critical thinking thrown in there as a value. What makes you inoculated or not desiring to be involved in social justice? Or what turns you off, and what didn't turn you on about it?
Well, I'm a big proponent of individual rights. I'm a big proponent of individualism, but I'm a big proponent of individual rights.
And what convinced you that would be your guiding light?
How did I get there? That's a good question. Because I was early, when I was younger, I would have been like a European socialist type. And then through college...
So America's taking care of your security, and you just get to like run around with free healthcare.
Right. Well, my dad is from England, so some of his politics kind of like got into me, I guess. Even though he's I'm certainly not that anymore. I think I became kind of conservative through college, which was weird because I was in Western North Carolina my whole life, which is super conservative, and I wasn't conservative at all. I was very lefty, progressive, universal healthcare, all that jazz. And then college, I kind of changed a little bit, and then after my undergrad, I went out and traveled a bunch. I worked in Japan, I worked in Alaska, and I eventually sort of made my way to the conclusion that anything except individual tragedy is personal. When one person dies, it is a tragedy. When one person is violated, it is a tragedy. And anything except a framework of individual rights is bound to violate the individual. And, because it's like, I'm one step from a pacifist, man. Like, violating individuals is a bad thing. It's terrible. The only time force can ever be used, in my mind, is in self-defense. But how does that inoculate me? Well, because it's not, social justice type stuff is very collectivistic. It's very group rights oriented.
Okay. And is that a failure of your imagination to not be able to exist on that collective sphere? Or
could be. Could be. It could be. I just don't get it.
Okay.
I don't get it. It's like it just seems so intuitive to me. It's like, no, I didn't do that. Like, slavery is an atrocity. I didn't do that. Right? That seems very obvious to me. Mm-hmm. That I didn't do that. So anything that says no, you did that and you're guilty for that, it's like you're not living in reality, man.
Okay.
You're living in some, what have you, but some very thick constructed subjectivity that isn't quite well aligned with the real world.
So do you think that privilege is like the light version of collectivism then? Like just the idea of promulgating
it is collectivistic.
And so how do you approach the idea of your privilege?
Well, certainly I have. As a group, I reject it entirely. Certainly I have privilege. I mean, I'm living in America. It's 2020. It's not 1820. It's the best time to be alive ever. That's a privilege. I'm relatively educated. That's a big privilege. I'm very grateful for that. But there is nothing really about the color of my skin or my sex that as a absolute rule shapes my experience in society and shapes society through me, let's say. And here's an example. You can just, there's counterexamples to this. I was in a course with someone, and we were talking about white privilege. And, she said, she was a very nice German woman, not exchange student, but just international student. And she said, we were talking about whiteness and white privilege. And she said, all white people have white privilege, and they're always going to have a better time than any black person. And so I was like, okay, well, let's bound, because I'm always trying to let's parameterize this. Okay, you've said something. Okay, to what extent? Is it an absolute, or is there a parameter to it? Because once we find that parameter, then we can have a conversation. So I asked her, I was like, okay, a white, uneducated, drug-addicted, child of a broken home in West Virginia, and Barack Obama, who has privilege? She said, well, the white guy. It's like, you're out of your mind. You're out of your mind if you think that guy has privilege.
So she couldn't reel it in?
No, she's like, and then, because if you say, yes, the white guy has privilege, it's like, well, then it's an absolute, it's an axiom, right? It's just like, that's how you see the world.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I was like, well, I can't have a conversation with you if this is just your axiom. It's like trying to have a conversation about free will or something. Yeah. It's like, it's kind of fruitless.
Yeah. We're doing geometry without Euclid's,
there you go.
4 things.
Yeah, there you go. Euclid's 4 things.
Or is there 5?
I don't know. I'm a social scientist.
That's interesting. So, Yeah, the just trying to navigate the part where we try to see where are the axiomatic principles, where is the bounds of this stuff. If this is a religion, we can define it as a religion. We can really concretely define it as a religion. We can probably say, no more teaching this to kids in public schools.
Yes, we shouldn't teach that.
No more making corporate headquarters about this stuff. Like, this does not belong in a secular environment, right? So
right, it shouldn't be. I mean, insofar as we separate any religion, any church, and anything, we should also. If this is that kind of way of thinking, then that's the kind of separation that there should also be.
Yeah.
You know, if people want to. I would just like more transparency about it. Maybe that's it. Because it's like, if you want to have a Catholic school, have a Catholic school. Yeah. If you want to have a social justice school, have one. But don't make it the one that all kids have to go to, right? Because that's shitty. That's violating church and state. And just more transparency about it. To say, like, yes, this is how we see the world, and, you know, because but of course I won't do that, because the American, like, tradition of religious freedom is, I have a religion, you don't have to believe it.
Yeah,
which is not what this is about, right?
It's
so
in its evangelical infancy. You know,
it's like it's more like deep fundamentalism. Yeah. It's kill the non-believer sort of ideas.
Yeah, they're on a jihad for sure.
Yeah, that's one way to say it.
No offense.
No, if you want to be, like I said, you can believe whatever you want to believe. You just can't make other people, you can't force other people to do that at the end of a sword or what have you.
Or cancellation.
That's a rough one. That's a really rough one. Because on one hand, there are some people who, deserve a lot of criticism, but I think that band has been blown out of proportion.
What do you mean?
Right? Like, anyone who does anything can now lose their job. Some people should lose their job. Like the commentator who said, oh God, I remember it maybe 15 years ago, because my mom was pissed about it. It was like the commentator who was watching like WNBA who said nappy-headed hose. Do you remember that?
No.
Remember that? A long time. Google nappy-headed hose, and this clip will come up. Which is a very racist thing to say about professional black women. You probably shouldn't say that.
Okay.
And he said it like as he was commentating a sports game, and that was like something he said. It's like, you probably shouldn't have that guy commenting the WNBA. I get that one.
Oh, this isn't the WWF. This is WNBA. Okay.
WWF can get away with whatever they want. That's the Wild West as far as I'm concerned. I can't remember that guy's name, but like that's an instance. It's like, yeah, I get why that guy should lose his job. That's really unprofessional and pretty racist. But someone likes a tweet of whomever, that guy shouldn't lose their job because they like a tweet, right? So there's a creep of this is just becoming everything, and like they say, the left will eat themselves eventually, but they'll get through everyone. They'll cancel everyone else first, right?
Yeah. Or cast them into the deplorables basket.
Yeah, the basket,
it's
right?
Getting bigger and bigger.
It's a big old basket. It's big. You can choose the basket or the canoe. Those are your only choices.
Oh, I know where I'm going. Yeah. Get me some wicker time.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, we should wrap this up, and I'm going to put the camera on Bijou, because it'll be one of my very rare interviews that has cat footage of it.
Congratulations for reaching the end of the podcast. If you enjoyed this product, consider donating to this channel via paypal.me/Benjamin Boyce, or joining me on Patreon. Also follow me on Twitter at Benjamin A. Boyce. Have a good night.